To commence the second panel, if people could find a seat. So please make your way to the seats. We will begin shortly. Joe? I'm just introducing this, right? We're not doing any introductions of me. I'm just going. All right, here we go. Good. So I'm Steve Hansen, Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Washington in Seattle. It's my distinct honor and privilege to be here today to chair the second panel on the topic of rethinking the human rights issue in U.S.-Russian relations. I also want to say that it's been a pleasure over the last 20 years of my career to work very closely with the Jackson Foundation in Seattle and with Laura Whitson in particular, as well as with the Kennan Institute and with Blair Rubel and everybody here, the amazing team. It's really a joy to work with everybody in this outfit, and you can see the kind of quality that the Kennan Institute and the Jackson Foundation put together. The second topic for today is going to take the themes from the morning and broaden them out just a little bit. And with apologies to Sam, with whom I had a nice conversation yesterday, we realized it's his idea, I'm going to steal. There's really three axes to the conversation that we're going to try to bring into play together. And it turns out all three of them are integral and inextricable. So on the one hand, we have the historical legacy of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and its universal significance for human rights activists around the world, its potential continuing relevance, as was discussed in the morning, for countries like North Korea, let's say, and others which do deny the right to free immigration and are non-market economies. So we have the legacy of Jackson-Vanik and how to honor that amazing achievement. On a second axis, we have the question of U.S.-Russian relations and the misunderstandings about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment on both sides, which are part of that question of how to improve relations with Russia in such a way as to achieve other goals that those of us in the room hold dear, including those on democracy and human rights. But then there's a third axis, which is the question of human rights in Russia itself, and the rather negative trajectory of human rights, particularly in the last decade, which cries out for some kind of U.S. policy response and the response of concerned citizens. And how to get all three of these triangular relationships into one conversation is very tricky, because it turns out there's really no way to act on the legacy of Jackson-Vanik in a way that's faithful to that without talking about human rights in Russia today. But there's no way to talk about human rights in Russia today without talking about U.S.-Russian relations and how to make them better. And so here we are with a distinguished group of panelists who are going to start tackling these broader themes. It's really the perfect group to do that. I'm just going to give you the first sentence of their bios because you know all of them are available to you. We have Sam Kleiger, who's the Director of Russian Affairs at the American Jewish Committee. We have Blake Marshall, Senior Vice President and Managing Director of the PBN Company. And we have Sarah Mendelson, Director of Human Rights and Security Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we're going to go in the order that is on the program, beginning with Blake, and everybody will have 15 minutes, give or take a minute only.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks to the Kennan Institute, the Wilson Center, and the Jackson Foundation for the invitation to be here with you this morning. I've been asked to offer some comments that represent the business community or private sector's perspective on the question of Jackson-Vanik and its application to Russia. So I will try to offer some remarks in basically three areas, what the business community tends to think about the ongoing issue of Jackson-Vanik and the annual review process as it applies to Russia, the implications for the trade relationship between the United States and Russia and where we are in our bilateral commercial relationship, and then third and finally, what, if any, impact there is on Russia's plans to join the World Trade Organization. Let me begin by saying that over the years I've become pretty well acquainted with the views of the private sector in broad brush strokes, and I'm happy to make a few generalized comments along those lines, but pretty clearly, obviously, any concrete opinions that I express are purely my personal views. I think it's safe to say that the views of the business community on the continuing application of Jackson-Vanik to Russia are heavily influenced by the concept of linkage. That is to say, the tying of Jackson-Vanik and the extension of PNTR, permanent normal trade relations, unconditional MFN is what it used to be called, to Russia's WTO accession package. And personally, I think there are conceptual problems with this sort of linkage, but the reality is, just in purely practical terms based on where we are today, that this is one of the many ways in which Russia has the misfortune of following the Chinese PNTR debate and China's WTO accession. After China failed to fulfill many of its terms of its package in IPR and other realms, Congress has taken the approach that it effectively reserves the right to review the deal on WTO that is ultimately struck with Russia before granting it PNTR. Key congressional committees and certain industry groups are less inclined now to take it on good faith this time around with the only remaining large economy outside the WTO. So the implied leverage on these WTO negotiations then is that only a rock-solid, airtight accession package will pass congressional scrutiny in the PNTR debate. And then, and only then, on that basis, the vast majority of American companies will actively support Russia's removal from the Jackson-Vanik provisions when that time comes. So this is kind of an odd set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. But I want to back up for just a minute to comment on my own personal beliefs about Jackson-Vanik on the merits. Because in my view, this is something, a policy issue in our bilateral relationship that should have been dealt with a long time ago and in the right way, not in this sort of confused fashion that we find ourselves in these days. The amendment, I think the application of it to Russia has unquestionably fulfilled its original legislative intent and served its policy purpose. It was of truly historic significance. And so any conversation about where we go from here does not in any way diminish that legacy. That said, I do believe that the continuing application to Russia is anachronistic and puts us in the position of experiencing periodic distortions of the original legislative intent. We've had a tendency to move the goalpost, so to speak, implicitly redefining the statute with objections that are raised on Capitol Hill and elsewhere on a range of issues far outside its scope. And that may be partly because Congress has relatively few tools at its disposal to assert itself and try to influence U.S.-Russia policy, particularly when it comes to action-oriented votes in Congress. But it troubles me nonetheless, conceptually, to continually have Jackson-Vanik associated with important but unrelated foreign policy questions ranging from Georgia to Iran to a variety of arms sales, for example, notwithstanding the practical politics that I clearly recognize in each of those important cases. I would prefer to keep those issues in their own channels and not to continually attempt to redefine in the public domain what this amendment was intended to do and what it was not intended to prescribe. So secondly, as I move into the impact on our trading relationship, I just wanted to briefly provide you some context for how U.S. companies are viewing the Russian market these days. Our bilateral trade relationship had been growing steadily prior to the crisis onset last year. In 2008, the trade turnover between our two countries had reached $36 billion. It's not a robust trade relationship, not as robust as we would like it to be, but it's been growing steadily, and that figure is easily triple and quadruple what it had been in recent years. It is nevertheless a primary market for American exporters across the industry spectrum, from aerospace and agriculture and automobiles to chemicals and IT to machinery and manufacturing. And the market continues to grow in its importance. Just as we've become very familiar with the BRIC moniker over the past decade to describe the dynamism of leading emerging markets, just recently, PricewaterhouseCoopers has come out with a new forecast looking ahead over the next couple of decades that places Russia squarely within an E7 of emerging economies that will match the economic output of the G7 in the next decade by 2019. So in terms of the implications for our trade and overall relationship with Russia, I would divide these effects into the symbolic, which I think is a very large, substantial category, and the practical, which is a practically empty category. There's no question in my mind as to the huge symbolism associated with Jackson-Vanik, and because it is symbolically important in the relationship, it is an irritant and I think we have to face that. And it's a limiting constraint on the extent of the reset that's currently underway in U.S.-Russian relations, and the reestablishment of the mutual trust and confidence that's been sorely depleted in recent years. While we've made some positive pronouncements on Jackson-Vanik and what we intend to do at some point in the future, we really do need to get serious about backing those up by demonstrating good faith in fulfilling them. Oddly enough, it has no concrete practical effect on our current trade relationship, since Russian goods have enjoyed conditional MFN, NTR without the P, since 1992, I think. So first on the basis of presidential waiver in the first 2 years after Soviet breakup, and then since 1994 after receiving the annual certification that it is, in fact, in compliance with the freedom of immigration provisions in the bill. It would only have an impact if that certification weren't made, and that has become more than routine these days, to say the least. It could potentially have a dramatic impact in the future, though, when Russia accedes to the WTO, and I'll come back to that in the third category in just a couple of minutes. So while there's no practical impact on the terms of our trade, conversely, our trading relationship has an impact on our ability to remove Russia from the scope of Jackson-Vanik. And here I'm thinking primarily about the export of certain agricultural products from the United States. I readily understand why no one is inclined to grant any favors to Russia when inspections, certifications, quotas are being tinkered with and various protectionist games are being played. But I think we also have to honestly and candidly recognize pretty clearly that neither is Jackson-Vanik acting as a deterrent in this regard on this question or any other economic or foreign policy issue, in my view. And more to the point, I think it's simply wrong to construe this as a favor to Russia, giving them something that they want. That may have been the case many years ago, but I believe that we're well past that point, and I think the notion of a trade or trade-offs involving Jackson-Vanik has lost whatever logic it may have once had. In fact, the Russians kind of firmly believe, and they say so at senior levels publicly, that this is our problem to solve, and it is our anachronistic sort of legacy that's on the books as it applies to Russia, and it's one that's caught up in our own bureaucratic politics. So third and finally, I'll conclude with a few observations about WTO, which leads us to the important kind of bottom line takeaway for today. Jackson-Vanik doesn't have any impact on Russia's plans to accede to the World Trade Organization. There are any number of other obstacles that are impeding that progress, but this is not one of them. It only becomes a problem when Russia does join at the point of membership in the organization. At that time, the pressure is really on for the United States for us to deal with what I've just described as our problem. To remove Russia from that grouping, subject to the provisions of Jackson-Vanik, and extend PNTR, or to invoke Article 13 on non-application of unconditional MFN, PNTR. The latter option, which is really not an option, would be an unmitigated disaster for American companies with far-reaching ramifications, and I would say for our overall bilateral relationship as well. U.S. firms in this scenario would not be able to take advantage of all the hard-fought concessions achieved during Russia's accession process, ironically, most of which were arrived at by intense U.S. negotiations. These include large reductions, 10% or more in some cases, in import duties for new cars and civil aircraft, an average tariff rate on industrial goods that would be reduced from roughly 12.5% down to around 8%, and greater market access for a variety of industries ranging from financial services to telecom. Nor would the U.S. then have access to WTO dispute resolution procedures if and when Russia might violate some of those new rules of the game. So it's a very, very bad scenario that we need to contemplate going forward as Russia continues its WTO discussion process in Geneva. All in all, the result for us would be a severe erosion in U.S. market share in one of the most dynamic emerging markets, one that is fueled by consumer demand and ever-rising disposable incomes. That same PricewaterhouseCoopers study that I referred to earlier, by the way, also projects Russia to be the top European economy and the fifth largest economy in the world by 2030, in one more decade. So in a group that matches G7 output, in this next decade and one more decade out from that by 2030, a top 5 economy globally. So you can see then that American firms are heavily invested in positioning themselves for the long term in Russia for all the right reasons, and that's a message that needs to be understood more broadly in Washington, in the executive branch, on Capitol Hill, so that officials are prepared to act at the appropriate time. Steve, I think I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to our discussion.
Perfect, Blake. Thank you so much. And you've actually allowed Sarah to have 2 extra minutes. So, Sarah, would you like to take
5
17?
cents apiece.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the colleagues at Canon and the Jackson Foundation. This is a long overdue conversation. I can't recall the last day-long meeting on human rights in Russia that I've attended in Washington. So it's terrific. And I want to, at the outset, associate myself with those who praised the role that Jackson-Vanik played in the 1970s and 80s, but also acknowledge that as a tool today, it is a combination of not useful, not relevant, as one of the architects or several of the architects of the amendment suggested. So what I want to do is tough. I want to talk about the current human rights situation in Russia and what tools we have in the U.S. And in Europe, both in government and in civil society, to support and advance human rights in Russia. In short, the situation in Russia is serious, and by some accounts, the culture of impunity is worsening, despite, I would say, some encouraging rhetoric by President Medvedev. There is a limited amount that we on the outside can do to change the situation on the ground, and we need to recognize that. But we need to also recognize that we're not doing all that we can do. And I want to focus my comments on what that would look like, what more we can do. In brief, 2009 was a very bad year for human rights in Russia. By our count at CSIS, there were 10 human rights defendants and journalists who were killed with impunity. Their killers still at large. Another way of measuring the situation, a delayed way, is to consider the voluminous number of cases before the European Court of Human Rights. In 2009, the number was 13,666 cases. That was up from 10,146 the year before. For some countries, that is 15 times the number of cases that are going to the court. For other countries, certainly from Eastern Central Europe, it's 3 or 4 times as many. The court is flooded with these cases, and we have lawyers in the room who present at the court. The court is functioning as a substitute for a domestic judiciary, and that's not what the European Court of Human Rights is meant to do. Now, part of what is going on is the extreme violence in the North Caucasus. It has spread to other parts of Russia, but it's also spreading, the cases are spreading into Europe. We also chart incidents of violence in the North Caucasus. In 2009, we found 1,100 violent incidents. That was up from 795 the year before. And they were increasingly lethal, over 900 individuals killed. We also registered 15 suicide bombings in the North Caucasus, most of which were in Chechnya, and that was up from 4 the year before. I'm sure there are other metrics that we could use to talk about the situation in Russia. Given this picture, if Jackson-Vanik is not an effective tool, what tools do we have? And I want to suggest that this is not only a situation of trying to advance actually human rights in Russia, it's a challenge for the human rights community more generally. I want to suggest 5 tools, and I'm sure that people in the audience can suggest some more. One is effectively using information. 2 is increasing awareness and attention, and this conference is a great step in that direction. 3 is raising and spending funds wisely. 4 is increased coordination with friends and allies, including possibly targeted sanctions. And 5, and this may strike some as controversial, I know, because I've had conversations with you before about it. 5 is increasing our own compliance and accountability on human rights issues. I want to take a minute to go through each of these and suggest where we on the outside can do more, but also remind ourselves to be humble and that it is ultimately our colleagues who fight the fight every day in Russia who are on the front line. Russia's fate is up to Russians. We can help support, we can do more than we're doing, but ultimately it is not for the Americans to come in and fix. All right, so how can we do a better job supporting? Number one, information. We need to support the gathering of information on abuse and the monitoring of events on the ground. This has been critical for decades. It continues to be. One way that we do this at CSIS is through public opinion surveys with the Levada Analytics Center, looking at how Russians think about human rights and abuses, how they experience abuse. We've done over a dozen large random sample surveys. We think this is an important way to help activists on the ground because, as in any country, it allows for the activists to understand how their local populations are thinking about issues, and it gives them the potential to grow a constituency for greater demand with compliance. We currently have a survey in the field with the Levada that is looking at how 20 to 59-year-olds in Russia are thinking about history, Stalin, Sakharov, human rights, and we think that the data just might be useful in challenging what some of us call absent memory in Russia. And we hope to be sharing that later in the year with colleagues. Another way another tool is attention. Obviously, naming and shaming have been in the toolbox for a long time, but specifically naming and shaming those who tolerate a climate of impunity is important. And I feel that 2009, we missed several opportunities. The White House and the Department of State have issued statements in 2009 and just last month every time an activist has been killed or activists are detained, and that's extremely important, and some say it's not enough, but it's important to recognize that it's been going on. The President and the Secretary of State and other senior Obama administration officials have met with human rights defenders when they've come to Moscow. But we have missed an opportunity to shift the burden from activists on the ground to diplomats, policymakers in the United States and European capitals, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. One thing we've really missed in terms of attention is hearings. How many hearings did Congress hold in 2009 on the human rights situation in Russia? There was a hearing, or it might have been an issue forum that the Helsinki Commission held before the Moscow summit. But by and large, despite our best efforts, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has not held a hearing on impunity in the North Caucasus. The same is true in the House. We talked in the previous panel about whether or not Jackson-Vanik needs to be amended. There's been some ideas floating around in the break that possibly there could be some set of coordinated speeches, maybe by the President, maybe by House Speaker Pelosi and Senator Reid, that on the one hand acknowledges perhaps that Jackson-Vanik is irrelevant for Russia, and the one right that Russians do enjoy freely is travel and immigration, but then laying out the number of rights that are under threat. So that's something we can explore. Another tool is funds. The U.S. support for democracy and human rights is extremely important, and a number of private and public donors have decreased their funding precisely as human rights abuse has increased in Russia. The Ford Foundation unfortunately closed its offices in September. That means $10 million that goes to the support of civil society in Russia is no longer available. And the USG and others need to be thinking about ways to make up that gap. But I think the way that the funds are delivered needs to be rethought and revisited. I've written about this following the experience I had helping to convene the Parallel Civil Society Summit. It's a piece that CSIS published called From Assistance to Engagement, a Model for a New Era in U.S.-Russian Civil Society Relations. And the argument is pretty simple, that we need to listen and respond to local needs and work with NGO colleagues to help them listen and respond. We can do this through survey data, but the point is that whenever we're spending money, that we're doing it in a way that shows that we're actually listening and responding to people. But I also think we need to shift how we engage civil society in Russia. Instead of sending Americans, and I was one of them, to Russia to teach, talk, and train, I worked for NDI in the early 90s, I think that Congress and the administration need to shift support to regular peer-to-peer dialogue and engaging in projects, even supporting projects that that bring Americans who work on the United States together with Russians who work on Russia. It may well be that the era of having Americans go to Russia to teach and train was a good idea at some point, but I think that era has moved on, and that's certainly an idea that I heard loud and clear when we were in Moscow in July. And we can talk in Q&A about the merits of this as well as the difficulties. All right, 2 more tools. One is coordination, and I alluded to it in the beginning of my comments. Congress and the administration need to do a better job working with our allies to speak with one voice on the issues of impunity in Russia. We need to shift the burden from those who are on the ground every day documenting the impunity. We need for parliamentarians, diplomats, and policymakers. And the murder of Natasha Estemirova was, I thought, possibly a tipping point. And there was, particularly having the Swedish presidency of the EU, and there was a flurry of emails, and could we possibly convene a brainstorming session of bringing Americans and Europeans, government, non-government, together to think about what would a new and different policy on challenging impunity in Russia. But could we do that? Well, the answer was no. Either no, or people were not that interested. But after a lot of push, it didn't happen. And it's my hope that the murder of Natasha Estemirova was not in vain, and that we can get that momentum back in 2010 to get people to the table. But I think that we need to acknowledge the situation demands a new strategy. The cost that the Russian government bears for these murders is virtually nil. We can do several things. We can call on the Russian government to fully investigate the murders and to leave no possibility uncovered. The suggestion that President Medvedev had that the locals could not be involved in this needs to be challenged. And the investigation needs to stay at the highest level in Russia. We could also talk about the merits of possibly having targeted sanctions. As Chechnya opens 6 foreign offices in Europe, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Poland, France, and Denmark, we might talk with those governments about what those offices are and whether or not there's money and financing that is linked to authorities in the region. All right, the last point is about compliance and accountability. The fact that Russia belongs to international organizations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the G8, just to name a few, and has signed on to numerous human rights-related treaties, means that those are potential pressure points. But I would say that they have not been the most promising. I think if you went back 30 years and you thought getting Russia into those international organizations and signing on to those norms was going to be powerful, we now find ourselves in 2010 with the problem of how you get from commitment to compliance. Well, here's one way not to get to compliance, and that is for the United States to be non-compliant. Whether or not the U.S. is compliant has an effect on our ability to advance human rights and democracies elsewhere. There are lots of arguments that you can make in terms of national security, in terms of counterterrorism policies, about why we shouldn't engage in various conduct. I'm making an argument at the moment that addresses our ability to advance democracy and human rights. And this is not to make in any way, shape, or form an argument about moral relativism. The fact that Bush administration officials acknowledged that torture was committed at Guantanamo does not mean that we should turn a blind eye to torture and disappearance in Russia or anywhere else. The point is simply a pragmatic one, that as long as this is the case, it means, and I've interviewed lots of American diplomats and policymakers, it made it almost impossible for them to advance pushback on issues in the North Caucasus. The Obama administration gets this. The president raises the need to get our own house in order and close Guantanamo in every major foreign policy address. It's critical to our friends and allies around the world. There are many of you that I've spoken with who are working in Russia who want to see this happen. It's not going very well if you spend any time in the U.S. There are lots of challenges, and perhaps a gentle message to Obama administration officials would be, don't waver in your commitment to do this. It's certainly a message that was delivered to the president himself by Yuri Jabalazzo when the president came to the Civil Society Summit in Moscow. I want to end with a point that it's not just about compliance, but it's also about accountability for crimes of the past. One of the most important and I think underreported positive events in 2009 in Russia was the video blog that President Medvedev made on October 30th, the day of political prisoners. He was speaking the words, if I may, Arseny, he was speaking the words, I think, of Arseny Roginsky. And while Arseny may be cynical about this, or skeptical, and he may rightly be skeptical, I think we cannot deny how unusual it is to hear a Russian government official articulate essentially the message of Memorial, and how powerful it was, I think, for a lot of us, particularly to see President Medvedev actually at a memorial in Magadan. I think it is fundamental because if we want to see human rights culture develop in Russia, it depends in part on a reconciliation with the past and accountability for the past and for the victims of Stalin and not glorifying Stalin. This is not only for Russia. Countries around the world do a poor job in accounting for past crimes. The United States has done a poor job of it. I would say that policymakers around the world find looking back distinctly unfriendly. And the burden that a lot of us have is trying to raise awareness on how not accounting for the past has very specific effects on political and social development in countries around the world. So, to conclude, maybe it's possible that the U.S. and Russia can spawn an effort to examine specific periods of the past and encourage policymakers not to be afraid of such activities. I think it might have just a positive effect on our own compliance and perhaps support human rights activists in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those thoughtful comments. And finally, we have Sam Kleiger.
Thank you. First of all, I'm sorry I'm a little bit under the weather today, but I would like to thank Jackson Foundation for organizing this, for sponsoring this conference, and Kennan Institute for inviting me. Thank you very much. That's not the first time I'm invited to Kennan, and I hope you will continue to invite me again. Despite the fact that I may be a little bit aggressive today. I will concentrate on the triangle that Steve mentioned, basically which has two angles: human rights situation in Russia, the U.S.-Russian relations, and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment legacy. Well, the chain of events leading the Jackson-Vanik Amendment is very well known now, and after the panel that was this morning, we know much more about that. I would like just to mention a couple of turning points, really, literally a couple of turning points. When in 1972, the Soviet regime imposed heavy tax on education on those individuals wishing to immigrate, protests from the free world immediately followed. By the end of 1972, it became clear that the Kremlin would not get any favorable trade deals as long as the education tax is in place. Notorious Politburo meeting that Richard Pearl so eloquently quoted this morning became available, the minutes became available only a few years ago, but I was living in Moscow at that time, and I remember very well, of course, not the Politburo meeting, because it was a secret meeting, совершенно секретно, and I was definitely not invited to the meeting, but smart people created a joke which was kind of a expression of what was really going on in Politburo. There were people very scared of that. They said, well, if we will allow people to go, what's going to happen? And it was a joke that Brezhnev and Kosygin allegedly was pro-immigration. We don't know exactly, but that's where the rumors about him he discussed with Brezhnev the issue of immigration, and Kosygin said, so what's the point? We need the good relations with the United States. We need to buy some grain from them. We need, this is an obstacle. And Brezhnev said, what do you want? If we will allow everybody to go, so what's going to happen? Only two of us will stay. And Kosygin said, no, you will stay. Ты один останешься. I mean, that was the notion that was the fear that the Soviet authorities had about the Jackson-Vanik and the entire idea of immigration. That's the basic human rights. That's one of the basics. I mean, Lyudmila Alexeyeva, I would argue the point that this is only the only right that remains in Russia now. Probably there are some few more, but that's something basic, because if you allow people to go from totalitarian regime, that's beautiful. Like many other Jews, I was in Moscow and I was considering immigration exactly at that time. And I was very much enthusiastic about Jackson-Vanik because I thought that now the process of immigration will be simplified, and some Jews who have relatives in Israel and receive the visa from relatives, they will be able to go, and I was one of them. Well, it will be fair to say that in the short run, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment became an obstacle, because the Soviets reacted very tough on the Jackson-Vanik, and even stopped the Lend-Lease payment to the United States, the Lend-Lease that remained after the World War II. And the immigration fell dramatically in 1973 to only 13,000 a year from 35,000 in 73. So many people became Refuseniks, with all miserable consequences of that. Well, some hopes improved again when, after an adoption of the Helsinki Accord of 1975, immigration numbers went up again a little, but 10,000 of Soviet Jews became Refuseniks. Among many others, I applied for an exit visa in early 1980 with the hope that window of opportunity will be open in preparation for the Moscow Olympics, and with the fear that it would be closed afterwards. The worst scenario, of course, realized after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in Christmas of 1979, and I, along with thousands of other Soviet Jews, became a Refusenik, in my case for 10 years, with all the miserable consequences and stigmas related to this status. Of course, the amendment played a great role, and I would even trace it to one of the factors that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As I said, in the short run, the Jackson-Vanik led to more restrictions on immigration. In the long run, it was a big victory of the human rights. Anatoly Dobrynin, I will quote him. He was a former ambassador of Soviet Union to the United States. On his book, he writes, I quote, "Our biggest mistake was to stand on pride and not let as many Jews to go as wanted to leave. Instead, our leadership turned it into a test of wills that we eventually lost." So as a matter of fact, he admits that the impact of Jackson-Vanik on the being defeated in the Cold War. But let's look now at Russia today. And I would argue that acknowledging that I am not a big admirer of Putin and Medvedev regime, nevertheless, to be fair, I would like to mention 8 points that, of course, I'm risking to вызываю огонь на себя. Nevertheless, I will mention it. First, acknowledging the fact that there are serious violations of human rights in contemporary Russia, there is also a need to acknowledge Russia as a new state, a new player on the international arena, a state which is not identical or even similar to the Soviet Union. It would be inaccurate to equate today's Russia with the Soviet Union and to apply approaches similar to those used in dealing with the Soviet Union. Similarities between Russia and the Soviet Union that some scholars, journalists, and human rights activists emphasize are rather superficial. Let's look at the bigger picture. 1. State-sponsored anti-Semitism in Russia simply does not exist. It's an established fact. 2. Freedom of immigration is not an issue for the last 20 years. 3. With some minor restrictions and some state support for the Russian Orthodox Church, religion in Russia can be freely exercised. Lyudmila Alexeyevna didn't mention that. 4. While it is true that most of the media, and especially national TV channels, are under state control, some basic elements of freedom of press exist. Novaya Gazeta, independent newspaper, often critical of the government. Время новостей, liberal, small circulation paper. Независимая газета, privately owned newspaper. To a certain extent, maybe Коммерсант also. Radio Echo Moskvy, Gazprom-owned, editorial independent station. Gazeta.ru, privately owned website. Many or even most of the book publishing houses, also independent, and most important, the Internet. These are just examples. As a matter of fact, as was reported in Bigotry Monitor recently, chief editors of leading Russian mass media wrote a sharply worded letter to Interior Minister Rashid Nurgaliev regarding the story of Andrei Stenin, you know that. This letter could not be imaginable in Soviet Union. Number 5. While many of the big corporations are also controlled by the government, small and middle-sized businesses, enterprises, are privately owned and operated. Of course, with corruption as an imminent factor, and people explore the right of ownership and exercise entrepreneurship. 6. With all the negativities of the authoritarian regime of Putin-Medvedev, majority of people in Russia support the sense of quote-unquote stability and order associated with the regime. Putin approval rating fluctuated between 70 and 85% during all 8 years of his 2 terms rule, and Medvedev enjoyed a similar rating during 2009, according to the most independent Levada polling center, whom I trust. 7. With some notorious restrictions and pressure that the Russian government applies to NGOs, many domestic and international human rights groups successfully operate, though in sometimes hostile environment. 8. On the international arena, though Russia is still nourishing its imperial ambitions, of which Georgia is a current example, and playing tricky games on some issues like Iranian nuclear aspirations, it is willing to cooperate on some important problems such as arms control, space exploration, nuclear non-proliferation. Russia, and this is now widely recognized, is not a strategic threat to the United States. It is rather, I would call it, underestimated and even underappreciated natural ally, especially in the war against terrorism. To summarize and to put in historical perspective, Russia is today less anti-Semitic, more open and West-oriented, less oppressive, more supported by its people, and freer than probably ever in 1,000-year history. Of course, there may be some exceptions, some may argue that between February and October of 1917 and some of the Yeltsin period. By the way, idealizing Yeltsin, I would also be very cautious with that, with the shooting at the Russian parliament in 1993 and so on. I would say about 94, 95, the end of his first term, that was the most liberal part of the Russian history. I'm not talking about putting Russia in geographical perspective. If we look around, we will see east of Russia, east and south of Russia, we will see Central Asian republics with some problems with human rights and many other problems, more oppressive regimes that are in Russia. We look west from Russia, we will see Belarus, to a certain extent Ukraine, which is, thank you, good. And a couple of moral and pragmatic issues that I would like to mention, which has to do specifically with Jackson-Vanik Amendment. I was very confused after I learned that Jackson-Vanik does not need to be removed or repealed. But some communist countries, including China and Hungary, were granted the most favorable nation status by the Congress as early in 1979 by Congress, by the United States Congress. Even within the first year of Carter presidency, officials of his administration asked Congress to alter the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And attempts were made in the late 1970s to exempt the Soviet Union from Jackson-Vanik restrictions as immigration from the Soviet Union increased. Now, the first 6-month waiver was granted to the Soviets in December of 1990 by President George H.W. Bush, when immigration reached a very high level. And after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia and other successor states of the former Soviet Union were granted the most favored nation status on the annual basis. And in 1994, President Clinton formally recognized Russia's full compliance with the Jackson-Vanik provisions. And in 2002, President George W. Bush asked Congress to legislate to exempt Russia from the Jackson-Vanik. Why should President ask Congress if it's not applicable? That's the question. On the other side, in recent years, many other countries of the former Soviet Union, out of 15 countries of the former Soviet Union, 7 graduated from Jackson-Vanik. 3 Baltic states, Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, we don't know why, and most recently, Ukraine. By the way, American Jewish Committee advocated strongly before the Congress to repeal Jackson-Vanik against Ukraine. When we are talking about repealing Jackson-Vanik, we are not talking about taking it off the books. It should stay in the books forever, but it should be a special congressional legislative act to repeal Jackson-Vanik for Russia specifically, as it was done for Ukraine and many other countries. And I will conclude with the dilemma of choosing between what is morally right and the pragmatism of realpolitik has been always on the U.S. agenda vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. And Jackson-Vanik is a good example of this moral stand, as was Ronald Reagan's calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, and is part of political and public discourse now. Well, as for the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, in evaluating and re-evaluating the Jackson-Vanik today, the dilemma does not exist, since repealing the amendment would be both fair and pragmatic. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we have only half an hour for, I'm sure, a very controversial set of topics to discuss. What I would like the audience to do, if possible, is to keep the questions as short and direct as possible to each panelist so that we have time for the panelists to respond and to include as many people as possible. So who'd like to go first? Sure. That's you, yeah.
I'm Marilyn, look at the favorites. Howard University. I have a question for you. Teaching at Howard, I've learned a couple of things. Most importantly, my students were born after the Soviet Union. How do we reinterpret this whole idea of linkage and that it has actually an important role to play in promoting human rights even today. It used to be easy. The Soviet Union was big. You know, we had divestment movements against South Africa. Guess what? The Soviet Union fell apart, and Nelson Mandela became president. It's not as easy to define now. How do I sell my students in this whole idea that linkage is still important?
Is there anyone?
Reinterpreted.
That's a hard question. Well, I mean, you can show your students that it was important in very specific cases. I think it's an open question for us to discuss whether or not, particularly in the case of the North Caucasus, whether or not we should be exploring targeted sanctions or travel bans. Is there a way of addressing linkage for very specific aspects of impunity in Russia? Some people I've heard make the argument pretty persuasively that yes. There's voluminous amounts of information on abuses that have occurred there. In fact, the day that Natasha was murdered, there were a group in Moscow that released a 2-volume book that I think the NED supported the publication of, which was advocating for an international tribunal on Chechnya. There's maybe one journalist who wrote about it in the West. I mean, it's really just gone unnoticed. So, I think it's an open question about whether or not there's specific ways that we can explore developing packages that would be helpful.
Okay. Next question. Yes.
Okay, here it comes.
Regarding the idea of the substitution for what you would have if you repeal it, the peer-to-peer programming, the problem with that, it seems to me, is that it introduces a kind of false symmetry between the two sides, because the tools that the U.S. movement can use are things like impact litigation, Freedom of Information Act, so on, and our counterparts don't have that at all and face death threats. So it really does seem like a test of wills that we will lose if we repeal the amendment. And my specific question to Blake Marshall is what, vis-a-vis what Richard Pearl said this morning, is if you have an executive waiver saying that it does not apply to Russia, could you make that a permanent? What is the language within the amendment itself or with other practices that you could invoke to have a permanent waiver for Russia that would leave it in place for things like Turkmenistan and would avoid having the test of wills lost by the U.S.?
Mike, you want to start? And then Sarah.
Sure.
So my impression is that while some congressional action is required to authorize the president to make a determination or a finding that the provisions of the amendment no longer apply to a particular country, Russia in this case, if that is the case, and I'm happy to cede to people who are more expert on the technicalities than I am, that by definition leaves the framework on the books. And from a personal standpoint, I think insofar as we're talking about other countries such as North Korea or Cuba, there may be very good reasons for leaving the entire package in force and doing what we've done for countries ranging from Mongolia to China, and that is bringing up to date the application as it applies to other economies that are market economies, especially, which Russia obviously is, and to proceed that way. So I think you have to. The human rights community needs to come to a judgment about the overall impact of the framework and its applicability and usefulness. My cut at this is the very specific application of it to Russia, which I do think is anachronistic.
Sarah?
Thank you, Kathy, for the question. The peer-to-peer approach came about after a lot of interviews with different, or the idea for the peer-to-peer idea came about after a lot of interviews with different activists. It turned out that when I went to Moscow in April 2009, Ludmila Mikhailovna was in Washington at the very same days in talking to people about essentially the same model of a peer-to-peer dialogue. So the first thing to acknowledge is that among the human rights community, there is an interest and a desire, despite the fact that clearly there are very important asymmetries experienced by the two communities. So there's a desire to move towards a peer-to-peer dialogue, and we need to figure out how to address the asymmetries. That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm particularly interested in human rights as a part of civil society, but civil society in Russia and in the United States are much broader than just human rights. And what we had in July, and what I hope will go forward in some kind of regular meeting, would involve peer-to-peer addressing public health issues, addressing education, community economic development, new media. I mean, there's really an endless list. And again, there are going to be some aspects, extremism, I'm looking at Sasha, there are going to be some issues that lend itself, there are going to be other issues that don't. It depends on how much demand there is in Russian civil society and U.S. civil society. The market will support it if there's that demand. The market won't support it, I think, if there isn't that demand. But what was striking to me was that even in the most difficult part of civil society, in the human rights community, there was a желание, a desire for it.
Next question. Yes?
Peter Rosenblatt. I wonder if you could give us some sense of how we balance human rights as a high priority in our relationship with Russia against other high priority foreign policy objectives such as Iran. And secondly, do you see any prospect of a reform of the UN Human Rights Council to turn it into a useful instrumentality?
Mm-hmm. Sam, you want to get in on that one?
I can also only try to answer the first part of the question, because the United States human right, that's a separate story. It's always a problem how you balance the human rights situation with Russia. I mean, pragmatically, we need Russia in many, many issues. As a matter of fact, Russia is a permanent member of Security Council, United Nations Security Council. Russia is a member of Quartet, which deals with the Middle East problem. As a matter of fact, Russia is the only member now of the Security Council which is under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. It's always a balance, but again, we have to help Russian civil society to develop. As yesterday I said, that the human rights movement and human rights community in Russia has future. There is a social demand for human rights organization. There is a support. We discussed it yesterday. About 15% of Russian people trust human rights organizations in Russia, which is a huge, huge number. Also, I mean, as Sarah said today, that it's mostly the future of Russia and the Russian civil society is in Russians' hand. We can only help. But there are some very pressing issues like Afghanistan, right? Like Iran, the list goes on and on, that we have to cooperate. Well, I would say, off the records, probably there is, I have a feeling, my instinct tells me that today, now, we, United States, we need more. We need Russia more than Russia needs us. Off the records, please.
Off the record. Sarah?
Whenever I hear the word balance, it makes me nervous, because I think that it usually is a cover for actually imbalance. But I think that the whole idea of reset is often misunderstood, and there's certainly others in the audience who've written and spoken about it, and who can chime in. But I think people tend to think of it as either or, that we're used to a kind of dichotomy that either the U.S. government talks only about human rights and nothing else, or the U.S. government doesn't care about human rights. And the spirit behind reset is actually that you can do both, that there is not the kind of compromise, that you will try and work with Russia on Iran, but you will also make clear, as the president, when he first met Dmitry Medvedev, it was either the day or the day after, Lev Ponomaryov had been beaten. and he brought it up with President Medvedev. So it's a kind of, we can walk and talk at the same time, that this is not actually forcing us to choose. On the UN Human Rights Council, unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic. I was at a meeting in Ditchley Park in December, and there was this, it was on human rights, and it was this huge divide in the meeting of people who were from the UN system and spoke literally almost a different language. I mean, every time somebody would speak, I'd think they're speaking English, but it's like this Geneva speak. I have no idea what they're saying. And for the rest of the human rights community, people also needed translation into some other kind of English of what the UN speak was. So I think there's a much larger problem. It's not just who's populating, and there has been an effort to reform the Commission. We may need other tools or international organizations. One very good idea that came out of the Ditchley Park meeting that we might want to consider, and I think it was sort of alluded to in the first panel, was a annual index of leaders, naming public leaders of different countries and their attitudes and actions on human rights. If there could be an agreed upon list of criteria, that this isn't some abstract thing. This is, how is Barack Obama, how is Dmitry Medvedev or Putin graded every year, and have a established list of criteria. That would just be one tiny example of you know, a whole menu of things that we can think of to try and bolster what is, I think, really a big weakness in the international system.
Yeah, John.
John Hempelman, a lawyer from Seattle and a member of the Jackson Foundation. My question's primarily for Sam and also to Blake. We heard yesterday repeatedly, we heard from almost everyone today, that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment does not apply to Russia. It doesn't name Russia. Russia is a market economy. There's freedom of immigration. So the two critical aspects of the amendment are satisfied. We also heard that it's a very, very important symbol. I think everybody has said that it's a very, very important symbol. And it was clarified for me today that I don't think anybody's saying repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. I think what Sam is saying, make sure it's lifted off of its application to Russia. If it doesn't apply to Russia in the first place, don't you worry, as some other speakers have said, Sam, that taking specific action to say it doesn't apply in the Congress, which we heard yesterday would never happen for reasons we all know, but even promoting that idea is, in fact, handing the Russian government and Putin an acknowledgement that everything is okay. Don't you worry about that symbolic effect of taking some action to lift the Jackson-Vanik Amendment when it's not necessary?
Well, thank you for your question. Again, it's as was mentioned in this in the morning panel. It's a bit confusing. All countries of the former Soviet Union who graduated from Jackson-Vanik, and I would prefer to use this word, graduating. That's the better than removing, repealing, whatever, abolishing, whatever it is. It was a special congressional act. So my question is why there was a need for a special congressional piece of legislation to remove, to graduate Ukraine, signed by President Bush, by the way, to remove, to graduate Ukraine from the Jackson-Vanik, if the presidential executive order is good enough. So the same. Why should we Americans be unfair to Russia if they completed what was the provisions of the Jackson-Vanik? We have to graduate them. How they will interpret that, or how you will interpret that, or how the human rights community will interpret that, that's another story. Are we fair? I believe that we discussed the image of America. For us, for the former Soviet people who lived in Russia in miserable conditions, America was a symbol of fairness and the symbol of human rights and the shining city on the hill. Let's remain this way. Why we should be thinking, well, double thinking and have second guess what Russians will think? They graduated from Jackson-Vanik. Let's put the record straight. Let's give them what they deserve. And that's it. Finish with that. And then talk about human rights, which just separate muhi from kotleti. Thank you.
If it's the case that only an executive action is required to cease the applicability of the amendment to Russia, then I'd be very happy for it to proceed along that channel. That's not my operating assumption or impression. And if that were the case, I can't imagine why it hasn't been done to date, because there's been an awful lot of presidential talk about it over the years. So surely someone could have put pen to paper. So if that's the case, I'd be very happy for us to proceed along that path. My impression is that once captured at the time of the amendment to the Trade Act of 1974, that cluster of countries was defined, and then that's why we've gone through this country-by-country certification process or waiver process for a different category, and then ultimately the graduation process, which was, in fact, congressional action in every instance that I can recall. So I believe that's the case. Either way, if and when the action is taken, I'm not concerned about sending the wrong signal to Russia. So long as the conversation about new tools and new frameworks proceeds along its appropriate path, and I have no doubt that it will, and that we think creatively about the future and where we go from here, I think the power of the positive power of removing the application as a gesture of goodwill in resetting the relationship puts us on a much more even keel, and I think those arguments far outweigh any risk that it might be misinterpreted or misplayed.
Yes.
Dmitry Makarov, International Youth Human Rights Movement. Well, the idea of tying the human rights commitments and human rights requirements to trade agreements or to economic agreements, is up in the air in many other places. European Union is in the middle of discussing new partnership and cooperation agreement with Russian Federation, and they also undergoing the same type of debate. Mm-hmm. And perhaps one of the best examples of such a tie is the Helsinki Act, which laid the groundwork for OEC. And the pity is that OEC, as one of the instruments to address those concerns, is pretty much out of the picture in those discussions. Do you see such multilateral fora as OEC as one way to address those concerns without falling into the political debates which will inevitably come when you have two equal nations discussing various issues? Because OEC, where we talk about OEC or where we talk about Council of Europe, those are multilateral fora which have obligations that apply to all member states. And the discussions in those places gives it a whole different dimension.
Sarah?
Well, I really think we need maybe a revisit of Helsinki. I say looking at a Finnish colleague, that there needs to be a recommitment to Helsinki. And the effort to try and get the U.S. and European capitals to meet and have a conversation about impunity was, one little effort towards that. And clearly, one person sitting in Washington emailing isn't going to do it. I think we'd have to have sort of a community of people organized to try and advance this. I am somewhat skeptical about the multilateral approach just because it has been so freighted and so disappointing in so many ways over the last 30 years, and that what you really need, that ultimately this is about leadership. You need to have a whole cohort of leaders in many countries who really care about these issues and who are going to advance them, and trying to identify who those are and bringing them together, I think is important. But there's something about your comment that's been interesting and reminded me that 30 years ago, it really was so much about the the human rights economic linkage. And so much of what we've been doing over the last 5 years, 10 years, has really focused on the security aspect. And that, I think a lot of us think that that is it's a better hook in which to argue or explain to populations and governments why it is actually it's a Euro-Atlantic security concern of what goes on inside Russia, particularly if there are suicide bombings and impunity, that is more powerful to people at this point, although obviously we have more work to do.
I'll just add quickly, I'd also differentiate between OSCE and Council of Europe. OSCE, got tied up with these election debates in such a way now that it's almost impossible to get Russian participation. Council of Europe still has a certain internal moral quality to it.
But we're not as critical to the Council of Europe.
True. So Richard Pearl has a question.
It's actually an answer.
An answer.
Just to take one last shot at trying to clarify the question of the legal status of the amendment. The amendment applies to countries that deny their citizens the right and opportunity to emigrate if they are also non-market economies. The president need only find that a country is in compliance. That's the only obligation under the law. I believe that Congress has acted in other cases for two reasons. The first is there is another statute that has not been referred to today, passed in 1951, a classic piece of Cold War legislation that denied most favored nation status to a list of countries. If you were on that list, you couldn't get most favored nation status. And that had nothing to do with Jackson-Vanik. It preceded it, and it survives to this day because it has never been repealed. That legislation in 1951 requires Congress to agree to grant most favored nation status. I believe that's the reason why congressional approval was sought. But there's another reason, and that is for political reasons. When Congress believed the time was ripe to confer the benefits on this country or that, they wanted to express themselves. So the other statute would require, the 1951 statute would require congressional action. But that congressional approval could take place without any reference to Jackson-Vanik. And the fact that Jackson-Vanik doesn't apply need only be a presidential determination.
1 second. I saw the piece of legislation signed by President George W. Bush regarding Ukraine. The piece of legislation passed by both houses with overwhelming majority, and there is a reference to the Trade Act of whatever, that they complied with everything. That's there was no reference to 1951 legislation, as you mentioned. Well, it's available. Everyone can look at it. The Congress decided that the Ukraine should be graduated from the Jackson-Vanik restrictions, and that was a law signed by President Bush in January of 2006.
So one question will be, if Congress misinterprets a law long enough. With only 5 minutes left, I'm going to just quickly take two short questions here and here, and I apologize to those who didn't get in. So Alexander.
Alexander Verkhovsky, Sova Center, Moscow. Sorry, you mentioned that Congress became passive, I would say, on human rights in Russia last year. Why has it happened, and what can be done to change the situation, to push Congress to make more active and more regularly, what is important, I suppose?
And actually, I didn't realize Mark also had his hand up, so we should get his question as well. And then,
on the House side, things become custom, and legislative history enforces it. There's nothing in the law. Congress has been lobbied very heavily over the course of Jackson-Vanik on this country or that country, for and against. and you could see the progress before the fall of communism and afterward, and what happened internally, where the members needed the piece of paper to go home to certify that they knew what was going on. And they did their job on behalf of our folks on Buckeye Road in Cleveland for Hungary, the case I know directly. And the presidents involved, if you look at it, went along with it. They passed the legislation, which they're free to do. They can pass it about anything. And he goes and signs it with a ceremony, which means he gets those folks down there, gives them each a pen, a photograph, and the deal is sealed politically. It has nothing to do with the right of the president to stand up. And I would suggest that this debate could be settled really easily by putting some heft behind the notion of going up there and to the president's people and just simply say there ought to be a strong statement made which would allow the president to say we're not pleased as a nation wanting entry into the new world for them with this, this, and this, but in regard to Jackson-Vanik, we're going to go, and that would do a lot both ways. Because right now, I would guess that a lot of the members of Congress and staff still think, and maybe even get a lot of letters, urging the member to have that hearing as the marker by which some test at least could exist, because I must say the human rights issue is not on a lot of plates otherwise.
And the last question here.
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. There is the Smith Amendment, which calls, which asks that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment not be repealed as long as there's discrimination, official discrimination against religious minority communities in Russia, which does exist. Also, there are spin-offs of whatever the current status of Jackson-Vanik in official minds. There's a unit attached to the U.S. Embassy which monitors compliance or non-compliance with Jackson-Vanik, which does have some useful activities, although, well, they would like to see this issue addressed. And finally, in response to what Sarah was talking about, the North Caucasus, I believe Oksana Shelisheva was also involved in compiling these 2 volumes of information about specific members of the security forces who were involved in violations of international law in Chechnya. And that documentation, I know, is in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow.
All right, so that we don't lose too much time before lunch, let's ask each panelist just to respond and say a few words, about a minute, minute and a half each. Blake, do you want to start?
The procedural discussion that we've had here this morning is enlightening for me, and one that I will take away and think about. I do think then that on that basis, on the practical sort of technical basis of how we deal with these policy questions, it puts it in a slightly different channel in the bilateral relationship and in executive legislative relations on as it impacts the U.S.-Russian relationship.
I think somebody should pay to have those 2 volumes translated into English. I think that would really be tremendously helpful. Sasha, your question demands, I think, another conference. And I wonder whether it's really, is it only about Russia? Is it more general? Quick answers. Part of it is I think Americans have become increasingly insular, and that's reflected in part in Congress. I think the place that a lot of us go to speak about these issues, the CSCE, doesn't have a lot of teeth. Yesterday I was telling a story about, we did a meeting in Berlin on how to improve reporting in the North Caucasus, and we had a former staffer of Senator Edwards in the room, and who was at the time a fairly important senator. And the Russian colleagues, I said, where do you go when you go to Congress? And they said, oh, well, we go to the Helsinki Commission. And I turned to the staffer and I said, the Helsinki Commission? He said, what's that? I've never heard of it. So there's a complete mismatch on the activists coming to town and not always meeting the people because maybe they're not that interested. I think there was at some point a fairly pro-Putin sentiment among some Congress people, and there was sometimes a relegation of, well, that particular congressperson is really interested in Russia, they're particularly pro-Putin, we're going to let that happen. And they've got a lot of other things that they're doing. So.
Sam?
Once again, I would like to thank Jackson Foundation and Kennan Institute for organizing this long overdue conference. And I hope we'll meet again soon, like in 5 years, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of JacksonVanik, maybe the 50th anniversary of JacksonVanik. But at the same time, I would like also to call upon all of us to have a fresh look on Russia today and the post-Soviet Union space. There are many developments going on there, many interesting, many challenges. And the entire field is, to my humble opinion, is understudied and mostly discussed in dichotomy, as Sarah said, yes or no, black or white, good or bad, and so on and so on. As a matter of fact, the world is kind of a little bit gray. At this optimistic note, I would like to thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all three panelists for a really rich and exciting discussion.